So thanks again to everyone for being here and for sharing your work and being so generous with your time. We all really appreciate it. So maybe we could just begin by having you each say a little bit about the work and what inspired it, and a little bit about the production. And maybe, Marie, since you have to go, maybe you could start.
One second, this is a high microphone. Thank you all for coming. I'm really honored to be with these talented women. Flip the Record, we made it last September, and what inspired it was HBO actually came up with a short film contest. They were looking for Asian Pacific American stories, and my fiance Jason and I have been making a documentary for the last 2 years. Called Legions of Boom, which is about these mobile DJs in San Francisco, these Filipino Americans, and we've been actually doing that. Sorry, I'm like a little nervous. I haven't had coffee yet, so we were doing this documentary, and we've been collecting all these stories from such amazing people. And when this call came out from HBO, I had 6 weeks to make a short, and I thought, what should I do? What can I do in 6 weeks? And I thought of, since Jasmine mentioned I'm a music video director, so music is always my, what draws me to a story. I kind of like using music as language to like people to express themselves. And I think these Filipino American DJs, they did that in the 80s in Daly City. So what I wanted though was to have a character who was a young girl, because in the Philippines, my brother was a mobile DJ himself in the 80s. So I kind of used my own personal experience as well as was inspired by a story of DJ Symphony, a DJ in Los Angeles. And she also, she used her brother's turntables and taught herself. And her brother, DJ Icy Ice, is the DJ who actually designed all the sequences in the film. So it was a very personal story for me. And then when I shared it with Icy Ice, he was like, that's my story with my sister. And I thought that that was what really inspired me. And we did the film in 6 weeks, and we edited it for 4 days. And we had original music made in the Philippines and brought over, and Icy Ice used it because obviously we don't have thousands and thousands of dollars to use a lot of original music. I mean, not original music, but licensed music from the 80s. So that's sort of the inspiration for the film. And then, as Jasmine mentioned, we are premiering it tonight at Downtown Independent, and it's the world premiere. And actually, technically, you're the world premiere because you saw it, but don't tell anybody. So the ending, because of our relationships that we've forged with the people at Daly City, people have been giving us their tapes. And when I was watching the tapes to be inspired by a story, I literally was just watching hours and hours trying to get inspired, and I ran into that clip of DJ Symphony DJing, and the thing is, she's based in LA, and I got these tapes from people in San Francisco. So this is amazing because there was this crossover of the LA scene and the San Francisco scene together, and that's sort of what I picked out. I knew the ending of the film before I made the film, so I wanted to show the archival just to show people who are watching the film that this is not a made-up story. These are real people, and hopefully to drum up more interest about these amazing artists in these DJs who I think helped shape hip-hop, these turntablists. That's sort of where the documentary is focused on.
Thank you. I want to make sure that anybody who has specific questions for Marie that you have time to ask before she goes.
First of all, this is such an amazing panel, all these amazing Southeast Asian women filmmakers. So that's just astonishing, and it was really a privilege to see your work. I actually had a question for Marie and Nia Dinata, but they're linked. But Marie, my question for you is, so there's, So what's brilliant about your film is that it looks at this gender conflict or gender tension within the home, within two siblings, and then it marks that tension with music, right? And that turning point at the end where the brother accepts her turntablism, I'm not sure if I understand why, but I noticed that you have the album covers of two kind of icons of popular culture in the 80s in the Philippines. One is Gary Valenciano, who I would say is a kind of more middle class music artist, and then you have Tito Vic and Joey, who would be absolutely derided as kind of lower income mass culture and Baduy. And I was listening to hear if that was in fact their music, but I see at the end that the music is composed by Diego Mapa, who I think was your collaborator in Ang Nawawala, What Isn't There. So if you could just talk about those album covers, the choice of music, and if that is related to the turning point at the end of the film.
Unfortunately, it's not related to the turning point, but those album covers do mean a lot to me because the music of VST, I mean, obviously it's not Tito Vic and Joy's album per se, but the music of VST is sort of the disco music in the 70s that I wanted in the beginning. The first album that she scratches to, the inspiration for that music is that genre of music. And I had my other collaborator from Ang Nawawala, What Isn't There, Jazz Nicholas. He made original music based off of that genre of music because I couldn't, in that time period, license a VST song. And I think the record company industry is kind of like in shambles in the Philippines. So for me to even like begin licensing that music would have been a very long process. So that's one reason why you see those the Tito Vic and Joy albums, because it's sort of, I wanted to hearken that these are the albums of her parents, because a lot of the people who we interviewed, these DJs were influenced by music of their parents, and then they formed their own music tastes. So I wanted her to have sort of like if her brother was more forward thinking and used current American music, I wanted her to sort of be inspired by original Filipino music and merge it with like the sort of the music of new wave or hip hop, so that she was mashing those two genres together. The Gary Valenciano cover is more of just like an homage for an artist that of the 80s who did new wave music and who's also a very like I've worked with him and I really admire him, and I just kind of wanted to give him a shout out in the film. So those two were just kind of those were the thinking behind those two album covers.
And you had another question that was sort of interlinked.
Can I ask Mia, but she hasn't spoken yet?
Maybe it would be better if, what time do you have to leave?
4:15. What time is it?
Let's see. It's 3:53.
Oh, okay. So we can chill a little. Yeah, there's time.
Okay, so Mia, maybe you can talk a little bit about the film and then
Thank you. It's so nice to be here, reunited with Shireen. I know her since 2013. Yeah, so I made the film in 2013. We got invitation from a non-profit organization in Malaysia called Ikal Mayang, and they invited women director from Philippines, Indonesia, Brunei, and Thailand, and Singapore, and Malaysia. Okay, 6. Okay, and then I was one of the directors. At first, it's like they gave us freedom. Like if you have stories about women and gender, it has to be 10 to 15 minutes. Just, do it with only, I think it was only $1,500, no? 1,500 US. And then I was always excited to do shorts, because usually I've been doing feature for the past 13 years probably, and then when suddenly somebody gave me $1,500, I thought, yay, I can make a short film. And so the story is based on a real life story of my really good friend, a trans woman activist. And she told me that story about like early 2000, around 2003, 2004. That was what happened to her and her boyfriend. So I immediately thought about her. Her name is Ines. And then I just wrote the script and did that film with no budget for 2 days. And those are Indonesian actors who used to work with me previously. They were willing to do it for free. So so that's the behind the scenes story. Yeah.
It's incredibly beautiful, that film. So you already talked a little bit about the twist ending, right? Where we're sympathizing all along with the trans woman bride, imagining that she's the bride, only to realize that the twist, which is that the wedding is the closet, right, or a form of closeting. But I was struck by the use of sound in the film, and in particular that the inscription of Islam, and Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country in the world, all happens through, I think, off-screen sound. So, for example, the Muslim call to prayer. And similarly, in the wedding, which is Catholic, at the end of the film, the Ave Maria is playing. So if you could just speak to your choice of sound. Thank you.
Well, actually, Ines is Christian, my good friend, the trans woman activist is Catholic, but the boyfriend is a Muslim. So I just want to twist it. I thought, why not make the boyfriend Catholic, and then I don't know. I didn't tell in this film, but I imagine that she is a Muslim. That's why I designed the sound to have like the azan sound, the prayer for the calling for prayer sound just in the background. And yeah, Indonesia, like 8% of 250 million Indonesian population is Catholic, so it's a lot, right? So why not? Because you all know that we are all Muslims, and I am Muslim, but 8% of the populations are Catholic.
Maybe we can do a Q&A like this and have people respond to individual directors first and then as a whole after. Does that seem okay?
Thank
So
you.
other questions that are specifically about the wedding day?
You know what I was thinking of were the Yasmin Ahmad films.
Mm.
There seems to be sort of a flow from there with what you're doing. You know, being that you're mentioning the question of ethnic and religious identity.
Yes. Yeah. I love her work. We were good friends back in the days, and well, probably in Indonesia it's not as strict as in Malaysia. Interfaith marriage, I think, is not as strict like in Sepet, Yasmin's film, because I have an interfaith marriage. My husband is Catholic, I'm Muslim, so for Jakarta people, it's not a big deal, right? But I don't know these days because our society is changing for the past 8 months. So many people are getting very fanatics.
Well, even that thing about the Bangsa Malaysia idea in Indonesia, is there something similar about national identity as sort of a progressive one related to ethnic and religious?
Ethnic, yes. Bangsa. In Indonesia, we call it pribumi. That's the Indonesian. That's what that's what our founding fathers used to call ourselves, because the colonialists were the Dutch, and we are the brown people were the pribumi. But I think that terms has not been used for like more than 60 years, because there is no pribumi, I think, in Indonesia, because there's always mixed blood, whether it's with Dutch, like 10% Dutch or 5% Chinese. Indonesian people are always mixed, and we haven't used that term for such a long time. Not as in Malaysia, because like Malaysia, the Bangsa Malaysia is really, really strong. But in Indonesia, no, we are very, very diverse and proud of our diversity. It's been used for the past 8 months only because of the political reason. So if you read the news or watch CNN, probably like because we had this Jakarta government who is like Chinese Indonesian, they started to use that term, but we don't like that term because we thought that we are all Indonesians.
Just a point of clarification. Did you mean the Pancasila? Because Bangsa Malaysia is like we transcend Bumiputraism.
Bumi Putra, yeah, Bumi Putra.
So
yeah.
Bangsa Malaysia is where everybody is Malaysian first and
Okay.
then race second. So did you mean the Pancasila?
Yeah, I was referring to what you were talking about, Bangsa Malaysia as
So
Yeah.
it's slightly different.
Yeah. Okay. I thought it's like the Bumi Putra. You have that kind of term also in Malaysia. Yeah.
Thank you. That was an incredibly moving and film, and I really enjoyed it. And what I thought what I thought was quite powerful about it was in the kind of short film context, the twist in that I imagined that they were a couple, and her hesitancy about going back was related to meeting the family and being introduced as the partner, as the significant other. And then of course there's the twist, he's actually marrying someone else, and she's that's why she's hesitant, she's losing this person, right? And so I was kind of interested in maybe your development of that part of the storyline, right? That how this kind of the irony there, and in that there's this other possibility in that's alluded to, that he's bringing her home to introduce to the family as the one he's recognizing, not as a kind of affair that's under the table, but something that's going to be brought out into the open, and that there's that possibility, right? And I was just wondering if maybe you could say something about that, because I found that incredibly powerful as a viewer.
It's well, because I knew it's a story from my trans woman friend. And I knew her for very long time, and I knew that they were in a relationship. But then one day she told me that he's gonna get married with a real woman, and then the woman was from a village, so she's a fashion designer, so she wanted to make the kebaya, and I was like, oh my God, you're so kind. Why? And she did that with love. But her story is linear, right? Linear. And because this is a short film, when I wrote the script, I just had to, play with the character, and made that kind of surprise, because I thought, why not? If you see Ines, you would think that she's a woman too, right? If everybody in this room see my friend, you would think that she's a woman. So it's just a creative solution, because otherwise if it's too linear, it's gonna be a little bit
I think it's also
boring.
very powerful in terms of suggesting what could be,
Yes.
what's possible if people kind of open their hearts and open
Yeah.
their minds about this.
Yeah, and then they are still living happily ever after. Like the kid, they both got kids, and Ines always babysit. Yes, I wish I could make a feature out of the film. Yes, maybe. Thank you.
Hi, those films are incredible, and I'm very glad to be here. And I have a question to Marie, that the Flip Record, because except Flip Record, all those films, I just feel like a little bit, a little bit upset and a little bit sad. So, I'm saying, like, the Southeast Asian we're all Asians here, and those films, like Marine, your film is made in America. So it's like, do you think, and other films were like more native Asian films, so do you think there is something like some happy American ending like between, and like traditionally, I don't know, sad or like upset Asian ending, you know what I'm saying? Like, is there something like here, something difference between this? So yeah, that's it.
So is the question, because I made the film in America, it needs to have a happy ending?
Yeah, kind of.
No, it's really interesting because I moved here less than 4 years ago from the Philippines also. So I grew up there, and it's true, my film was very sad too, like my feature. So I guess I've never been confronted with this question before. I do think though maybe audiences, I mean, I don't usually make a film to think, oh, I want an audience to like it, because I want to like it predominantly, but I think that particular story warranted that kind of an ending. No, I that's true. I guess I don't. It is a very. I do think that maybe in making something in this country and having it in the back of the head that the audience will be predominantly American, you kind of don't want to. But it's not. I don't know either. Like, because I remember when I submitted to HBO, one of the programmers mentioned to me that our film was one of the happier ones. So, like, it was like one of 3 happy ones. So I guess I'm just a happy person right now. I don't know. I can't. I'm sorry. I can't answer your question.
Well, I wonder if maybe, do you think it has anything to do with basing the story on people that you're interacting with, or real people that you're interacting with?
That probably is the case, because the real story is quite an inspirational one, and then the darkness in that story is just it's like a sliver in that the real story we were making a documentary out of. So I guess that it really doesn't warrant, that particular narrative doesn't warrant any depression or darkness. But if you feel that it needs it, I will consider.
Why there's a fiction here, we're all Asians, like people like in America, we want like happy ending, and like people in Asia.
But it's in part because you're building the story of these thriving artists and such, and you want to tell that side of it, and they are an active, positive.
Yeah.
Yes. That's exactly it.
Anocha, because it was like a film within a film, or I just wanted to ask you whether that was an actual film, because there are well-known people who are kind of framing the film, right? There's Gong Riti, I recognize. So could you say a little bit about the process of how the film came to be?
Actually, the whole thing was scripted, and it was based on the characters of those people played by Gong and Chakawan, who's a filmmaker, and Soraya, the director. They were real filmmakers. Gong is a film critic, but I cast him to play a producer, so I kind of made it a little bit more confused for everyone. So and it's actually a trilogy. So this is the third one in the series. The first one is about kind of like platonic love, and the second one is about love between mother and daughter. And this is the last one, as you see here at the beginning, is the third in the trilogy, is the conclusion. And I was inspired to make this film because I watched a documentary that was made in the 70s. And that documentary is a real incident of the factory workers' occupation of this jeans factory, and they shut down the factory, and then they started to produce the jeans and selling them themselves, and they were mostly female. So I think I watched it maybe like going back to what Sudhar was saying. In 2006 we had a coup, and that was really a wake-up call for me in many senses. I felt like suddenly I didn't understand the society in which I was living in, and started looking back into the history, the political history of my country. And then I learned that there was this documentary that was shot in '76, and just a few months, the months leading up to the massacre of October 1976. So I watched the documentary, and I was really impressed with the workers. They were very, actually very articulate. The way they spoke about the reasons why they shut down the factory. How they were being mistreated, and the injustice imposed on them. So I was working on the idea of this trilogy. So I started to write about this one. So the whole thing was actually, well, I can't say it was scripted, but with the room for flexibility, because I knew that I was going to be shooting in a factory where I would have limited control. So I knew I was going to cast a famous actress to be essentially herself. But then at one point we will start following a real female worker in that factory. But I didn't have someone in mind for that part, so I was finding her in the real situation. Yeah, so I think, and actually with the opening scene, not the opening scene, the first scene you see at the factory with all the workers leaving the factory, they were all extras. They were not real factory workers, because the factory, they had to keep going, like they couldn't. They were working really, so we actually had to get those people to act for us. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask how you, when you were filming in the factory, how did you decide which girl you were going to follow after?
Well, it was I think a combination of reasons. One was this woman. She stood out for me because somehow she seemed a bit shy, but not at the same time. She was also a bit confrontational. Yeah, no, that was a really weird. I don't know how to describe it, but because everyone else seemed to be like either really into their work and not interested in being, in the film, or they were very eager. So, and she was kind of different. I mean, there was something about her that really caught my attention. So it was really very instinctive, I would say. Yeah.
I have a question. This is my question before I leave, and it's for my. Sorry, I'm asking a question. I'm on the panel, and I'm asking a question. Okay, great. I would ask everybody, but this is the second, I think, short film I've seen of yours where you start off with like a cinematic process of an intention to create something. I'm referring to a film that she made called Ghosts in film school, where. And it's a director interviewing an actress, and then they're talking about a film that they want to create, and then it goes into the film that they're making, and then it goes and follows real people in Thailand also. What is that about that that draws you to that? Like you mislead people into thinking that we're into the cinematic process, and then you actually use real people, and it actually veers more into like documentary,
Yeah. Yeah. No, actually, the film that's showing tonight is also a bit like that.
I was thinking of that because I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. But I have to say, Ghosts was actually a turning point for me because I went to film school and studied like very classical narratives, kind of storytelling, 3-act structure. Was the conflict resolution, all that. but towards the end of the coursework, I was getting a little bit fed up with this, and so I wanted to be, to find something that would, mean something to me, and then I made Girls, the film that she was referring to, and since then I've been doing that like 15 years already. No, I'm actually very interested in process, I guess. I'm very process oriented. And I don't know if it's my intention to mislead people as much as wanting to include everything.
It's like you're because film is just fabrication, but when you actually go into real people, it's like you're actually capturing reality. Right? Is it something, I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's an attempt to, I don't know if it's really reality, because once you have the camera, then it's still some sort of fiction, I guess, yeah. Yes?
It's not a question, actually, but a comment about that, what you were talking about, that process of overt fiction and less overt fiction. And the comment is, I really love that scene in the bathroom where the professional actor is washing her hands, and then the non-professional actor comes in and is washing their hands, and they acknowledge each other, and there's that exchange. So I actually disagree with you, Marie, that she's misleading. She wasn't. She actually showed us in that scene this kind of moment of kind of like a passing of the torch, where the narrative pivots from the professional actor, to the non-professional actor. And I just thought it was just a beautiful moment.
Thank you.
Don't get me wrong, I love all the work. I wanted to know I've always wanted to ask her this question. It's just great to get to do it here. And with that, I thank you so much. I have to bounce, but thank you so much. I will see you later. Thank you so much, Jasmine, for inviting me. Thank you so much.
So should I keep giving them the mic? Okay. Okay.
Helps us think through the present moment and the current kind of maybe gender politics that we find ourselves in today. Wondering if you could talk about that connection between past using archival as a way to think about present moment gender politics. I'm thinking particularly of T and Anocha's work. Maybe you can talk a little bit about 11 Men and maybe why you chose the particular actress and the juxtaposition with that actress and this sort of the script, and because that's something that I think the direct question is sort of pointing towards is the kind of the use of archival footage to create sort of like a social commentary about gender politics and history as well, that I guess comes in with the use of archival footage. So maybe you could talk a little bit about 11 Men.
So I make a documentary and experimental films and installation as well, and my work usually try to engage with history, especially of Vietnam in general, and like a lot to do with like memories and maybe like personal history or alternative kind of history, because like, you know, as Vietnam has been a communist country for very long time, and we only have like one kind of like official history written by the Communist Party. So I am always very interested in different kind of history, and I try to do with different work. I use it as a process for me to, at the same time, learn about history, but also to reflect on our relationship, you know, of us today with the past, and I was always wanting to use found footage as a way to engage with history. But you know, in Vietnam, it was very, very difficult, and still today very difficult to access the official documents or films or footage, anything like that. So I normally I just kind of play with what I can have access to. Whenever things became available, like online, or in this case would be classical movies being released on DVDs. About I think some years before 2000, they celebrated in Vietnam. They celebrated the 50 years of Vietnamese cinema, and they released many DVDs of like classics. So I thought that is like a good source for me to look into, and I wanted to do something with that. And I started with the first film from 2010. It's called Song to the Front. So it's like a re-edited. So it's kind of a way to reinterpret history in some way, and since then I did other found footage films using different kind of material. But since that first film had the same actress in this 11 Men, and I was very, I really like her acting, and she was one of the most famous actresses in Vietnam throughout the decades, and she acted in many films and still very active today, and so she appeared in many films, and I grew up with this kind of socialist cinema, and you know, maybe you have to talk more to one of our Vietnamese cinema scholar. They wrote a lot about gender through the film. I'm not a scholar myself, so I didn't really like analyze it in that way. But of course, you know, like the women would be portrayed in some way that suit with the Vietnamese tradition, but also they would have to suit the role of a socialist woman, you know, like, and in Vietnam, you know, because we fought for so long, like with the war with the French and America, and women had a big role, and actually they were always like being celebrated as a hero. We have a term like hero mother. So in Vietnam we have so many hero mothers. So from 2010 and later on, I always thought about at some point I would, when I have time, I would try to collect and look at many different films that she play in, and I think that her roles throughout the years would help me to build kind of a woman's story, that would kind of like portray a woman in Vietnam, or would show how women were portrayed in Vietnam or in Vietnamese cinema. So when I had time last year, I did kind of go through her films and try to tell a story, and I was looking for a text that helped me to tell the story and kind of make a narrative, and somehow it's kind of turned into, especially after I came across Kafka's 11 Sons, it kind of turned the story more from the idea of portraying this woman throughout the year to the series of portraits of men, but from one woman's perspective. And I really love the Kafka's short story of 11 Sons, and it's kind of an interesting twist to turn the relationship of the father to the sons, to a woman, to her 11 men, and also I was curious to like how it would work like across time and context, because the Kafka story was, of course, like written exactly 100 years ago, and from a very, very different context of Europe, and to apply it to the Vietnamese history. And for me, this series of the portraits of 11 men, telling through the decades of the Vietnamese cinema, for me, it's on one level, it's kind of telling the history of Vietnam through these decades. And second, it's a history of Vietnamese cinema through these decades. And I don't know what I can say about gender politics. I was mentioning in the talk in Santa Barbara that when I was looking for a text for the film, I had some other texts from a woman writer writing about her man, and it was much more obviously coming from a feminist perspective, and I much prefer to use Kafka's story. It was much more open to me, but like once you apply this for like giving the voice to the woman, it's just like naturally turned into a feminist perspective, but it's not like imposed beforehand. And I kind of like the way I make film and project. It's, for me, it's more like trying to build a structure and kind of like hanging the material. So I like to think it in a way that I contribute about half of the meaning to the film, but the rest, it's very open, and open for audience to interpret, and also open for the existing material as well. They have their own life, and I don't want to cut off like all the blood from the from the original, and they all kind of bring in their own possibilities, and also when you match them together, they also give birth to more possibilities. So I just live that in that way. Yeah.
Yes. Hey, when I was introduced to the Goethe Institute, thanks. Hey, when I was introduced to the Goethe Institute, which I understand might
at least give space to the Hanoi Doc Lab. I was told it was like an instrument of soft power. And so I was wondering, as a founder of the Doc Lab, do you catch grief for being introducing a Western narrative to Vietnam's media life? When I went to your office in 2013, there was a film that seemed funny and unoffensive to me about Vietnamese filmmaker, and made a story about English as a second language class in the United States, and it was censored because I think there was one of the students said, who wasn't Vietnamese, I think she was Tibetan, she said something critical of China. That's, I think, the reason why the film was censored. What I wanted to ask you guys was about how do you keep yourself or your ideas out of your students' work, or the people that are coming to the Hanoi Doc Lab to make documentaries? You're giving them technical skills and you're mentoring them, but how do you keep their vision? Do you feel like you ever any of your ideas bleed into their projects, and is that a concern for you, or do you think that's just a made up problem that I'm creating and just asking you about? I'd love you to talk about whether you think it's a legitimate, if soft power even exists in film, and if it does influence like the life and the thinking of people in Vietnam right now.
I think you might be overrating our power. We try to be some kind of alternative space for training, because we are really lacking that kind of infrastructure in Vietnam. We do have film school and art school, but they are operating in a very outdated, conservative mode. So we just try everything we can, and we have so little money to have any kind of power. But now we are operating as a collective, because actually nobody, get any payment from doing it, and it's a young country with many young people, and they were all very hungry for new kind of education and new way of expression. So it was exciting to be able to offer them some kind of alternative outside of the conservative school. I don't know how much I could influence them. We opened in 2009, and I was very, very active for the first few years. But, as an artist and filmmaker myself, I just cannot spend way too much time with them anymore. But we just have to rely on our students and younger people now. So I'm not sure how I can answer your question.
Shireen, that was such a fun film. I guess a very simple question would be, Tuding is a nickname, or Palayaw. I actually wanted to know what the longer name of that character is. But actually, I'm old enough to have remembered watching those 60s black and white post-studio era films. After the collapse of the studio era, you had so many exploitation films being made in the Philippines cheaply. We had our own James Bond, and of course we had our own, as you call it, pancit westerns, which I think is brilliant. And so I was wondering, one, if it was a kind of shout out or homage to some of the bad guys in those westerns, like Max Alvarado. I also remember two androgynous, kind of mestiza stars in that period. I don't know if they were in westerns, but they were definitely androgynous, and I was kind of wondering if Tuding is a shout out to those, and I'm totally blanking on their names now. And of course, I think one of the interesting things that you do is that all of those films were a kind of mimicry of of American genres, but your film, of course, infuses it with a lot of sort of critical historical consciousness about the Philippine-American War. And for example, that the Winchester rifles, I don't know what guns you're talking about, but I know that the Winchester rifles were particularly used in the American suppression of the Philippine Revolution. So I was just wondering if you could just talk about, there's so many allusions in your film, and just last of all, the bees and the flowers. Like, what is with that, with the bees and the flowers and that CGI bee at the end there? But of course, she has this line about the mga bulaklak, and then bee is, honey bee is just left in English, right? It's not, ano ba, bubuyog ba, or it's not Tagalog. It's not the Tagalog word for bee, but it's bee, right?
Yeah.
Versus the flowers. Okay, so I'll stop there, but it was really exciting. The film.
Thank you, Liz. So yeah, about the Western influence. I grew up watching a lot of. I had a weird relationship with my father because he didn't really talk much, so we just watched movies together, and mostly like westerns. And my grandfather was also, he didn't talk much, and then one day he told me the story about like how my dad came to be basically, and my grandfather was he was a soldier in the war fighting for the U.S. and he was from Cebu. And he ended up in Mindoro, which is an island closer to Manila, a Tagalog island. And he ended up getting this young woman pregnant. And then he fled, he went back to Cebu. And little did he know that her sister would come after him and force him to go back to marry her. And then I really thought it would make for a good Western. and I also, because like Nia, we were asked to make a film for this Southeast Asian omnibus, and with sort of a strong female voices, and I didn't know how to relate, and I remembered this story, and I thought how fun it might be to play with these roles and these I guess stereotypes, and also the genre, the gender and genre, I guess, and. So when I was doing research, I didn't know that there existed this Filipino Western genre in the 60s, 70s, and there's sort of a romantic comedy action variant of U.S. Westerns, and so I decided to. It closely follows my grandfather's story, but in this kind of Western guise, and what was. The exploitation films I wasn't so familiar growing up with, because actually no the bees and the flowers that was just there was just a metaphor. I just really I thought it was funny. The CGI bee, we wanted to shoot a real bee, but it was too hard.
Organizations and exhibition initiatives and production initiatives. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that aspect of your practice.
Oh, sure. So my husband's also a filmmaker, John Torres, and we wanted to make use of this the space in our house. Basically, we emptied the first floor of our house, and we had started to show films, mostly his films and other friends' films, in our garage. And once we emptied the first floor of the house, we thought we really wanted to make it into a sort of an active space, not just screenings, but workshops and artist talks. And we also were able to gather film equipment, like analog film equipment, from friends around the region who wanted us, or who saw our sort of hunger for to go back to this kind of tactile filmmaking, and they donated a lot of equipment. So we have this sort of DIY film lab, and there's this really great community around the world who are really making ways to keep film alive, like making new ways of producing film, like bleaching it to get a clear strip, and then recoding it with emotion, and then shooting it again. So finding ways to make their own. And we started doing workshops, and we really found the need, like Tia was saying, in the Philippines, the need for some alternative education, especially film education. But there's just yeah, it's this kind of traditional mode. Like everyone's really, that's even ways of ways of making and producing have become really standardized. Like the script submission and the pitching and all this. I mean, it's great that there's so many funding bodies now. There's Q Cinema, there's Cinemalaya, Cinema One, but they all have the same kind of standardized ways of producing. Although we get the freedom to make it our own way, but the ways of picking them are the same. And so we really wanted to give us opportunity for younger filmmakers and artists to make things differently, find their own ways of making. Yeah, so that's been a big part of my practice, I guess. Yeah, Super 16.
And some of my students and I have questions about the mode of address and the audience of these films. And you've mentioned already some of these films were funded by HBO, etc., etc., etc. And obviously, I love the fact that you foreground the cinematic imperatives, right? And I think it especially and the kind of mise en abîme, right, of these. But I'm also wondering whether we in the West, in France and Europe, we appreciate this mode, but how are your movies received in Thailand or Indonesia or Vietnam? I love, and my question to you is, there is a gender politic. It seems that by using Tran Anh Hong's movies, Cyclo, and there's a very, it seems to me a stark critique of his representation of Vietnamese movement, which I love, by the way. So I've written about that kind of exoticizing, which is masculinist vision that Tran Anh Hong deploys so often. So this is a question for the whole panel.
Yeah, so I started with short films, and they were shown in film festivals, outside Thailand, but also in Thailand. And then when I made my first feature, because of the 20+ rating, I only had like limited theatrical release. It was released in one cinema in Bangkok, and it played in the festival in Chiang Mai, not theatrical. So this was maybe 2010, yeah. So, but with my second feature, the one that's screening tonight, we had more exposure. So it was released in 4 or 5 cinemas. It's still limited release, but more cinemas this time. And given the fact that it was still not like a nationwide release, it did receive very good response. And I think, yeah, I was very happy with the responses from the audience and the critics and the awards. Yeah. So it was actually a surprise, because with this second film, I think it's not an easy film to watch. I should warn you, it's quite a challenge. It's a bit slow, but also, like, narratively speaking, is quite kind of obtuse. So yeah, the fact that people responded to it in Thailand, yeah, really surprised me, and actually it gave me some sort of encouragement in a way to go on, because it took me 6 years to make this second feature. It was not easy, and funding wise, the money came from actually half and half, like half from outside Thailand and half from Thailand. So yeah.
I think that the exciting thing about found footage is that when you make found footage film, you have a conversation, you are in dialogue with the original work. So typically you are being critical of the existing work. I think it's one of the things. But for me, when I do found footage film, I have kind of like mixed purposes, you know, like not just being critical and but I think that I'm also very interested in the potentials and the possibilities of material. I would like to think of myself as like a gleaner of kind of like trying to preserve or save something, like some kind of possibilities that might be existing in the material, but maybe kind of not obvious or buried in the material. Like normally, like in the narrative cinema, like the socialist cinema, propaganda cinema, or Trần Anh Hùng film or whatever, these kind of potentials would be buried by the narrative. So I want to dig out and kind of save something, glean something out of this kind of material that normally I don't really care about. So, for example, in the in the socialist cinema, I also find them really terribly boring, and I don't usually watch them. But I believe that that they have potential in them, that we need to glean this kind of things. So I look at them as potential for documentaries. Like I look at the socialist cinema as a kind of documentary because they contain the portraits of the people, and portraits are something that I'm very interested in. They contain just it's like you can look at them as a kind of ethnographic film. They would retain something of their time. They would show the mode of production at that time or many things. So when I work with this kind of material, I think that I'm both being critical or maybe in dialogue it's more precise, and also trying to save something out of because I think that now we always find it so boring and nobody wants to look at them anymore, and it's kind of a waste. Because we have a lot of socialist cinema. So I want to, by doing something like this, I can save some out of the junk. Yeah.
On that note, I wanted to ask you a question. I really enjoyed the film, and I feel like the narration kind of takes the actor who played in all these roles out of that position and kind of in the role of director in kind of creating this montage that develops a storyline between the roles that she was cast in, right? But through those roles, looking at the male roles. But I was wondering if there's also, because for me it doesn't have this quality, given that I am less familiar with Vietnamese cinematic history, a kind of for audiences who are familiar with a lot of the earlier films, is there a kind of affective dimension, even if it's not so much about the content of those characters, a kind of familiarity, a kind of jogging of the memory, a jogging of the senses that takes place when, oh yeah, that film as well, that almost could take the viewer on a type of emotional roller coaster in terms of the very different types of sentiments that each of those films conjures.
I think that for some audience who are more familiar with this film, they might have a bit more of emotion or something. I don't know, because I'm not too familiar with these roles myself. Because when I look at this material, I normally just scan through them, and I try to look for the bits that are interesting to me, especially the portraits. And I think that mostly it doesn't really matter, because like in this kind of socialist propaganda film, the roles are so like black and white, you know, like the enemy or the you know, like different sides, and there would be kind of stereotypes, of these roles, you know, like the with the soldier who have his eyes, operation, he would be like the big hero. So that is like how much I need to know about the role, and probably if you don't watch the whole film, the original film, you would kind of get it. Yeah. I think so.
Yeah, I was familiar with the later films, but I was
Yeah.
kind of interested in what the connections were, if not in terms of narrative, in terms of kind of the emotional sentiments of the film, particularly through her role, between the earlier films and the later.
I don't think the narrative is very important, and because my my intention is to take the narrative completely out of them, and I try to see if without the narrative, because I see the narrative is the worst thing that destroy all these movies. So I want to take them out and try to see without the narrative, can they function in a better way.
And I was wondering if there was a kind of an emotional appeal that I wasn't getting based on a lack of familiarity.
And I think the same for this actress. I found her interesting because compared to some other famous actresses of the socialist cinema, I think her portrait and her way of presenting herself, I think it's more ambiguous and not too kind of.
It's not me.
It's not too stereotypical, and actually she had a very different background. She would have a background of maybe like bourgeoisie, coming from a family of very famous actresses, and from the past, from the colonial time. So I'm sure outside of her roles of the socialist woman, she would have other roles at home or different perspective and things like that. And I think it would apply to all these actors in the movies. So everyone, like outside of the film, they would have, who knows what they think in their mind. And I don't believe that everyone, it's just that stereotypical roles that they play in the film. So I think that when you take all the narrative out and just leave their portraits alone, they can be a human again.
I wanted to ask a question for the whole panel as well. I was interested in a question that Philip actually asked Shireen last night about the degree to which you all see yourselves as Southeast Asian filmmakers or not. What do you feel?
I think it's definitely something we can relate to. Like I feel like there's so many there's like this similar shared histories, like intersecting and shared histories that kind of connect us for sure, but also just like the sense of rhythm maybe and sensibilities that that we share. That I definitely identify as Southeast Asian, but it's interesting to be put together because also we were asked to do something in that same kind of framework, and also to be here again. But this time, like talking more, because last time we were just showing it and we didn't even really talk about anything. So yeah, what do you guys?
Well, this is just my first time thinking because of your questions. Like, okay, we are Southeast Asian filmmaker. Because even in our first project, we didn't really talk about it. We just met and then shoot and then come back to screen the film. And then we screen it also in Kuala Lumpur, which is also Southeast Asian. So nobody really stress or ask us that kind of question, you know. So I think that was more in a framework of women filmmaker. But tonight, I feel like, we are Southeast Asian. We share similar stories because like Vietnam, I think Indonesia also has that period of Sukarno, our first president, where he leans towards socialism, and then we had really probably also great materials, but it's hidden somewhere because our government is just too busy not concentrating on the preserving the materials. And it's really inspiring for me to see what you did, like the footages, and try to reflect to our history. And I think it's kind of similar, our history. Yes.
Yeah, for me definitely. Yeah, I think not so much in the beginning, but over the years, I started to see the patterns in Thailand and my neighboring countries. We are ruled by dictators. It's a common factor. In the region, and and I think if you look through the films and what Shireen was saying, there is some certain some kind of sensibility that we share. Maybe it's a little bit slow, not always, but and so I would say
I didn't know much about other countries in Southeast Asia before, and also haven't really seen many Southeast Asian films. I'm so ignorant about every countries. Over time, and I feel so much more interested in knowing and sharing and connecting. One of the reasons why I didn't know much about the rest of Southeast Asia before was because Vietnam was really in a different position in Southeast Asia. Like especially the North and the whole of Vietnam after 1975. Were like in this different side of the Cold War. So like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and to some extent Myanmar, we're on like a different side of the Cold War, versus the like Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia. So actually before, like when I grew up, I would say that we were more in association with places like the socialist bloc of Eastern Europe. So like many Vietnamese filmmakers went to study in Eastern Europe, like Moscow or Prague or Berlin or something. So for a very long time we were not part of Southeast Asia at all. So now is the time for me to learn and to try to understand it. When I try to understand about the Vietnam War, because I study in the States, and so I can compare the different perspective of like American and Vietnamese perspective of the war. But now I also try to understand it from the perspective of other Southeast Asian nations and how all these different countries in Southeast Asia were connected or divided by this Cold War and by the American War as well. It was very confusing to me before, still now, but I'm trying to learn, and bit by bit trying to put the puzzle together. And before I was all so confused. What is all these countries in Southeast Asia, and then what is Hong Kong and Taiwan and everything? And yeah, so now like through the exchange and of the network and some chances to visit like one country after another, and I just did a residency in Hong Kong for 6 weeks, so that kind of helped me to also understand what is all the relationship of like Southeast Asia and also Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China, and so many bits and pieces to put together. Yeah, but so now I think that yeah, Southeast Asian filmmaker.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I know you guys probably have many more questions. Thank you so much for coming. Hopefully, yeah, you can sort of talk to them a little bit. Thank you for sharing.